Hi there. Tonight we step softly into a world where whispers were enough to kill, and where shadows in caves echoed louder than reason. We unravel the truth behind Europe's lesser-known witch trials. You've heard of Salem, of course, New England's tragic theatre of paranoia, but Salem was a ripple. Here, across the old world, the waves rose taller, darker, and far more merciless. Before we dive in, I'll ask you for two little favors. If you enjoy this journey, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me weave more of these long, peculiar tapestries of history for you. And drop me a comment with your location and the time you're listening. There's something rather magical about seeing night owls from Melbourne to Madrid and early birds from Hanoi to Houston sharing the same story. You'll find yourself in a quiet little fellowship of insomniacs, scholars, and curious souls. Now, get comfortable. If you're listening at midnight, don't worry, the witches won't come for you. Well, probably not. But do pull the blanket up. It's going to get cold where we're going. The caves of Zugarramurdi in northern Spain still breathe with damp air. And if you lean too close, you might just hear the voices that once sealed dozens of fates. Imagine the Basque countryside, early 1600s, rolling green hills that almost look too innocent. Whitewashed cottages with red-tiled roofs dotting the landscape, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The village itself, Zugarramurdi, was little more than a cluster of houses perched by limestone cliffs. Yet beneath those cliffs stretched vast caverns. The locals called them Las Cuvas de Las Brujas, the witches' caves. Children dared each other to creep inside. Echoes of their giggles bounced against the stalactites. But sometimes, if you asked them years later, they'd confess that the air inside had weight, as though centuries of secrets pressed down on their lungs. Villagers whispered that strange lights danced there at night. Some said they were fires lit by shepherds to ward off wolves. Others insisted they were Sabbath's witches gathering to feast, dance, and pledge themselves to the devil. And as always happens in fragile communities, whispers travelled faster than carts on the king's roads. Whispers, the softest weapon in Europe's arsenal, and the deadliest. It began with complaints. A cow's milk soured too quickly. A child fell sick with fever. Bread turned mouldy before its time. Who was to blame? Not God, he was too lofty for mould. Not the local noble, he collected tithes and taxes, untouchable. The blame fell instead on the woman who sold herbs, the widow who muttered to herself, the girl seen slipping into the caves with laughter. The Spanish Inquisition, infamous already, prided itself on sniffing out heresy like bloodhounds. By 1609, their gaze fell on the Basque country. Why here? Well, paranoia is like wildfire, it spreads to where the wood is driest. The Basque people had clung stubbornly to ancient customs, midsummer bonfires, fertility rites, herbal medicine. To the inquisitors, all of this smelled like sulphur and brimstone. Picture a grey-robed official arriving in Zugarramurdi, ink-stained fingers clutching a ledger. He hears rumours of witches convening in the caves. He takes testimonies, each more dramatic than the last. Because let's be honest, fear and gossip are a performance art. One man swears he saw naked women dancing around a goat. Another insists he heard chanting that made his crops fail. A child, trembling, confesses that witches licked his feet in the night. Absurd? Absolutely. Believed? Tragically. Yes. Soon, the list of accused grew. Shepherds, peasants, young girls, elderly widows. The trials became theatre. People crowded into halls, waiting for confessions. Those confessions, of course, rarely came willingly. Torture lent them a helping hand. Imagine being bound, iron pressing against skin, while men of faith asked whether you'd flown through the night sky. Under such persuasion, who wouldn't admit to a moonlit ride on a broom? And so, in 1610, the flames rose. Dozens were accused. 6 burned at the stake in nearby Le Greux, while many others, nearly 2,000, were tried, interrogated, or branded with suspicion. Think of that. In a region of scattered villages, nearly everyone either pointed a finger or had one pointed back. Here's the haunting irony. Not all inquisitors wanted blood. A man named Alonso de Salazar, father as one of the judges, grew skeptical. After months of trials, he noted that evidence was nothing but the smoke of lies. He argued that imagination, dreams, and gossip had been mistaken for fact. In a rare twist of history, his skepticism slowed the executions. In time, fewer witches were burned in Spain compared to Germany or France. But still, those caves remain stained with memory. Stand there today, in Zugarramurdi, and you'll find tourists wandering through the caverns, guided by electric lamps. They'll smile at the legends, take photos with witch dolls sold in nearby shops. Yet if you pause, lower your voice, and let the silence breathe. You will hear it. Not witches' chants, but the muffled sobs of villagers who once begged to be believed. Now, a cheeky reality check. You'd probably have been accused, too. Yes, you. Do you like herbs? Chamomile tea for sleep? Suspicious. Do you talk to your cat? Extremely suspicious. Stay up to late listening to YouTube history podcasts? Well, obviously you've made a pact with the devil. Congratulations, you'd be tied to a stake by now. But perhaps that's why this story grips us. Because deep down, we recognize how fragile reputation is. How quickly community warmth can turn to firelight on pyres. And so, with the cave still echoing, we step forward toward folklore, toward blood-stained cities, toward night terrors and controversies that refuse to die. The Whispering Caves were only the beginning. The caves of Zugarramurdi were not empty of story. Long before the Inquisition set its stern gaze upon them, the Basque people already filled the stones with myths, weaving the unseen into their daily lives. They whispered of Mari, the mountain spirit, who lived in a golden palace hidden within the rocks. Some claimed she had fiery hair, others that she appeared as a serpent, or a dazzling woman in silken robes, moving between peaks on storms of her own making. She was no demon, not at first. She was simply the wildness of the land given a face. But when religion sharpened its teeth, Mari's name, like so many women's names, became stained with suspicion. Imagine yourself in a 16th century Basque village. The mountains rise jagged against the horizon, cloaked in pine and mist. The people here are practical folk shepherds, farmers, woodcutters, yet even their pragmatism cannot silence their or the forces around them. A sudden lightning strike upon a tree. That was Mari, displeased. A miraculous harvest, perhaps Mari's blessing. She was as unpredictable as the weather, and in that way, perfectly human. Women kept the stories alive. Grandmothers by the hearth told children that Mari rewarded honesty and punished arrogance. Young wives whispered praise to her when storms threatened their fields. Herbalists claimed their remedies worked because Mari revealed secrets through dreams. These tales, innocent as bedtime stories, would one day be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. But let us return to Zugarramurdi around 1608. It is midsummer. Fires blaze high on the hillsides, bonfires meant to ward off evil, but also to celebrate fertility and the turning of seasons. Men and women dance in circles, hands clasped, skirts flying, laughter carrying into the night. Children chase sparks like fireflies. This was no devil's Sabbath, merely human joy wrapped in tradition older than Christianity itself. Yet for the Inquisitors, it was precisely such gatherings that stank of sulphur. After all, why should peasants dance when Rome demanded kneeling? The first accusations in Zugarramurdi did not come from grand priests but from neighbors. Isn't that always the way? Old resentments, envy over a goat that gave milk more plentifully than another's, suspicion when a widow lived alone yet never starved. One woman, Ma Adishimildegi, returned from France with tales of witches' sabbaths. Perhaps she meant to entertain. Perhaps she sought attention. But her stories were seized by inquisitors hungry for proof. She confessed under what circumstances we can guess and named others. The naming spread like a fever. Suddenly, children claimed their playmates had flown through the air. Shepherds muttered that their neighbors' wives milked cows with incantations. Fear wrapped around the community like ivy, tightening with each rumor. By the time the Inquisition held its infamous auto da fe in Le Grue in 1610, the fire was unstoppable. Now, here is where Mari reappears not as a goddess of storms, but as the scapegoat. To the Inquisitors, she was not myth but demon. If villagers confessed to meeting a woman in the caves, it must have been Mari, Satan's consort. If crops failed, Mari's anger was the explanation. Poor Mari, dragged from the clouds of folklore and shackled to the pyre of hysteria. And yet, let's pause for a cheeky observation. Isn't it always convenient? A powerful female figure, whether mythic or flesh and blood, makes people nervous. Easier to brand her dangerous than admit she represents something they cannot control. In modern times, we'd probably put Mari on a t-shirt and sell her as a feminist icon. Back then, she became Exhibit A in trials that ended with smoke spiraling into the sky. Picture the trial in Le Grue, a square filled with thousands, nobles and peasants alike, gathering to watch the spectacle. The accused are paraded forward, chained, their faces pale in the sunlight. Some recant, begging for mercy, promising to renounce witchcraft. Others, too weary or defiant, hold their silence. The judges read out charges, flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, cursing neighbors' fields. Most of the evidence, dreams, nightmares, stories told by children. Yet it was enough. 6 were sentenced to burn alive. Countless others, over 1,000, were punished with penance, whipped, or forced to wear humiliating garments marking them as witches. Imagine what it did to a village when half its families bore those scars. Suspicion became inheritance. Children grew up with parents branded unholy, and neighbors who had denounced them avoided their gaze in the marketplace. In the caves today, reenactments show mannequins posed in eerie tableaus, cauldrons bubbling, figures dancing. Tourists gasp, children giggle. But if you strip away the wax and kitsch, what remains is tragedy. Real men and women whose only crime was being caught in the web of fear. But we cannot leave this section without returning fully to Mary, for though inquisitors tried to crush her name, she survived. In Basque folklore today, Mary still lives on Mount Boto, moving between caves with the storms. She is no devil's bride, but the embodiment of the earth. Sometimes she appears as a ball of fire, rolling across the sky. Sometimes as a beautiful woman, her golden hair flickering like lightning. Even after centuries of attempts to erase her, the people remember. Is that not a kind of victory? That myths can outlast trials, that stories endure longer than judgments. So here is a thought for you, dear listener. Imagine you are standing in Zugarramurdi during midsummer. You see the bonfire, you hear the drums. Do you join the circle and dance, risking the watchful eyes of inquisitors? Or do you step back, silent, safe, but forever cut off from the joy of your community? The choice between belonging and survival is the knife edge upon which countless villagers balanced. And so, with Mary's shadow lingering in the caves, we leave Zugarramurdi smoldering. But Spain was not alone. Beyond its mountains, other cities would burn far hotter, and the trials would swallow not dozens, but thousands. Our next step takes us north, to Trier, Germany, a city that turned upon itself with a hunger no myth could explain. By the time we leave Spain behind, the smoke of Zugarramurdi still clinging to our clothes, the road bends north into the Rhineland. Germany, early 17th century, a land splintered by faith, war, and famine. The air itself seems charged, as though waiting for a spark. And in Trier, one of the oldest cities in Germany, that spark became an inferno. Trier was proud of its Roman roots. Ancient stone gates still loomed over its cobbled streets, reminders that emperors once walked there. But by the 1580s, pride meant little when famine stalked the countryside. Crops failed, the plague crept through alleyways, and the people needed an answer. Why did God punish them so? The simplest answer, witches. Always witches. At first, it was a trickle, a widow accused of muttering over her bread dough, a healer whose herbs smelled strange, a beggar who looked at a cow, and the cow died days later. These were the little sparks. But then came the fanatics, men in robes who believed the devil walked openly through Trier. They demanded not just sparks, but a blaze. Enter the Prince Bishops. Ah yes, the dangerous cocktail of religion and politics. Prince Bishop Johann von Schnenberg began rooting out heresy with fervor. Soon, trials were everywhere. They did not stop at peasants. Nobles were accused. Priests were accused. In fact, so many clergy were executed that parishes struggled to find replacements. Imagine the absurdity. A city so determined to purge itself of witches that it crippled its own church. Records suggest that between 1581 and 1593, thousands in Trier and its surroundings were executed. Entire villages were left with only a handful of women. The witch crease did not discriminate, it consumed the powerful and the powerless alike. One chronicler wrote with Grimoire, the city was purged of its inhabitants as if by a pestilence. Let's pause for a more human view. Imagine Greta, a midwife. She is neither noble nor entirely poor, known for her skill with herbs and her quiet presence at births. For years, villagers respected her. But one summer, storms ruin the harvest. When hunger spreads, someone remembers that Greta was seen muttering a prayer by the river. Someone else recalls her remedies sometimes smelled of smoke. The leap is made. Greta controls the weather. Greta caused storms. Dragged before judges. Greta denies it at first. But then the questions come. Sharp as knives. Did she fly on a pitchfork? Did she consort with demons? Did she curse the fields? The torture chamber awaits, its tools gleaming in torchlight. Iron boots to crush her shins, cords to twist her fingers until bones splinter. Greta screams until she cannot scream. And finally, words tumble out, not truth, but survival. Yes, yes, I flew. Yes, I cursed. Yes, I served the devil. But survival is not granted. Confession is proof enough. The judges nod, scribble, and pass the sentence. Greta's body, once trusted to deliver life, is condemned to flames. If you stood in Trier then, you would see pyres built high, like obscene festivals. Crowds gathered, eager for spectacle, as though execution were theatre. And in a way, it was. The roar of fire, the crack of wood, the shrieks of the condemned people listened, watched, and went home reassured that the devil had been beaten back another day, until tomorrow, when another name would be whispered. And here's the bitter humour of it all. If you had money, you could sometimes buy your way out. A noble might bribe officials. A wealthy merchant might escape with a fine. But if you were poor, or inconvenient, or simply friendless, the fire was already waiting. Witches, it seemed, were most often found among those least able to defend themselves. Curious, isn't it? How the devil always seemed to favour the powerless. The tragedy of Trier is not only in its numbers, but in its scale of madness. Think of it. An entire city turning upon itself. Lawyers who prosecuted witches were later accused themselves. Judges who signed death warrants found their own names whispered. It was a snake devouring its own tail. There is a record of one counsellor, Dietrich Flade, who dared to question the frenzy. He was wealthy, educated, respected, but skepticism was dangerous. Soon he, too, was accused, tortured, and executed. His death sent a chilling message. Doubt was itself a crime. If you hesitated to condemn, you revealed your guilt. The trials devoured even their protectors. By the end, Trier was nearly broken. The land lay empty, fields untended, homes abandoned. Survivors bore scars not only of loss but of complicity. After all, many had pointed fingers, many had testified, many had cheered the pyres, and in the quiet after the fire, guilt smouldered like ashes. Now, for us modern listeners, it's tempting to scoff. How could they believe such nonsense? Flying through the night sky, cursing crops with a glance, turning milk sour with a touch. But pause. Think of your own world. How quickly does rumour spread on social media? How fast does outrage ignite, sometimes without evidence? Replace the torchlit square with a Twitter feed, the whispering villager with a viral post, and you'll see hysteria is timeless. The stage has changed, but the play remains. And yet, amidst the tragedy, one voice stood out. Cornelius Lewes, a theologian who dared to speak against the trials. He wrote a manuscript declaring the accusations baseless, the confessions forced, the executions unjust. Brave, isn't it? Tragically, the Inquisition seized his work before it could be published. Lewes was arrested, tortured, and forced to recant. His voice was silenced, his words buried, though centuries later, fragments of his manuscript resurfaced, like whispers from the grave. In that, perhaps, lies the cruel poetry of Trier. The city that burned itself nearly to extinction also gave us rare glimpses of resistance, of men and women who refused to let the madness pass unchallenged. They paid dearly, but their echoes survive. Close your eyes now and picture Trier's ancient gates, blackened by centuries. Imagine the square filled with fire, smoke blotting out the sky. Hear the cries, the prayers, the jeers, and then imagine the silence after the flames die, when only ashes remain. That silence is the inheritance of Trier, a reminder that hysteria, once unleashed, consumes not only its victims but its keepers. We leave the Rhineland then, with our clothes reeking of smoke and our hearts heavy. But further east, darker stories still wait. In the shadows of Germany, legends grew alongside the trials, legends of creatures that crept through the night, tightening their grip on the terrified. These were not just witches of rumour, but nightmares with wings. They were called Nachthexen night witches, and they haunted both the imagination and the courtroom. The flames of Trier leave behind only smoke and silence, but in the hush of that silence, new terrors crept into people's minds. Nightmares do not need fire, they only need darkness. And in Germany, tales of the Nachthexen, the night witches, took root like ivy, winding around bedsides, whispering into dreams, until fear itself seemed to have wings. Picture it. A peasant cottage in the Bavarian countryside, 1620. The thatched roof creaks under the weight of snow. Inside, the fire has burned low, and a family lies huddled on straw pallets. The father sums softly, the mother clutches her rosary, and children twitch in restless sleep. Then, just before dawn, a shadow drifts across the room. It has no face, no form, only a presence. The eldest son jerks awake, gasping, clutching his throat. He swears he felt hands, icy and thin, pressing down upon his chest, choking him. He screams, "A witch!" The Nachthexen came. By morning, the story has travelled the village. The boy's wide eyes, The bruises on his neck proof enough, and somewhere, an old woman gathering sticks is suddenly the prime suspect. For who else could it be? This was the power of the Nachthexen legend. They were not witches you could see by daylight. They were shadows that slid between rafters, spirits that sat upon your chest and stole your breath. Today, we might call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was witchcraft beyond doubt, and in a world already primed by famine, plague, and the endless sermons of priests warning that Satan lurked behind every curtain, these tales became evidence. Auersburg, a German bishopric, became infamous for trials that folded such fears into law. Beginning in 1626, accusations spread through the city like wildfire. It started with women, of course, then men, then, shockingly, children. Entire schools of boys were accused. Imagine classrooms emptied, desks left bare, while their classmates whispered that the missing had been witches. One account tells of a child as young as 9 burned at the stake. His crime? Allegedly eating a communion wafer without reverence. Think about that for a moment. A boy, perhaps too distracted, perhaps too hungry, fails to bow properly in church, and suddenly the devil is in him. Suddenly, the Nachthexen shadow becomes his soul, and in a courtroom thick with incense and paranoia, no amount of denial can save him. The Auersburg trials consumed hundreds. Nobles, students, priests, widows all swept into the frenzy. One chronicler described it as a rolling snowball, gathering size and speed until it destroyed everything in its path. The Prince-Bishop, Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, believed himself a holy warrior, purging his land of Satan's agents. Yet what he truly purged was his own people, leaving whole streets empty, families extinguished. Among the records is a haunting confession of a woman who swore the Nachthexen had forced her to dance in the woods. Did she believe it, or was it the product of tortuous persuasion? We cannot know. What we do know is that her words, written shakily in ink, were enough to condemn not just her, but her neighbors. Once again, shadows became proof. Let's pause for a modern aside, shall we? Because if you've ever woken in the night with your heart pounding, sure that something pressed down on your chest, congratulations, you've experienced what doctors today call hypnagogic hallucination. Perfectly natural, if not pleasant. But in 17th century Auersburg, no one was reaching for a medical journal. They were reaching for the torches. And here's where the cheeky irony slips in. The Nachthexen, these supposed night demons, were blamed for strangling men in their sleep. Always men, rarely women. Isn't that curious? You could argue it reveals not demonic attacks, but guilty consciences. After all, who's most likely to wake with dread in a world of strict morality? Perhaps a man who'd slipped into temptation the day before. Easier to blame a witch than one's own wandering heart. The legend itself had roots deeper than Christianity. Folklorists traced the Nachthexen back to ancient Germanic beliefs in mere spirits, creatures that pressed upon sleepers, stealing their breath. From mere, we even get the modern word nightmare in pagan times. These spirits were mischievous, sometimes even protective. But with the spread of Christianity, they were recast as sinister, demonic, feminine. The night, once a place of mystery, became the devil's playground. For the people of Auersburg, though, folklore was no longer harmless. When the Nachthexen whispered in the dark, the courts listened in daylight, and so the flames rose higher, devouring more of the city's children, mothers, fathers. Close your eyes and picture the execution square. Rows of stakes, a line of terrified figures tied tight, the crowd roaring with prayers and curses. One chronicler claimed that at the height of the trials, fires burned daily. Imagine walking through the city, and every morning the air already smells of ash and charred flesh. This was not hysteria, it was ritualized annihilation. Among the victims was Dorothea Flock, a noblewoman whose execution caused even foreign ambassadors to protest. She was pregnant when accused. Despite appeals to the emperor himself, the bishop pressed forward. Dorothea was executed before she could give birth. Her death rippled through Europe as a symbol of just how far the madness had gone when not even a child in the womb was spared. And yet, even here, there were whispers of resistance. Letters smuggled out of Auersburg spoke of doubts, of judges uneasy with the endless accusations. One wrote that if the trials continued, soon there will be no one left to burn. That line alone is both darkly humorous and utterly chilling. It is the logic of hysteria exposed. If you keep purging, eventually you purge yourself. The Nachthexen, then, were more than legends. They were metaphors for the suffocating fear that hung over the city. The real strangulation was not of men in their beds, but of a community choking itself with paranoia. Today, in Germany, The term Nachthexen has a strange twist of fate. During World War II, Soviet women pilots who bombed German positions at night were nicknamed Nachthexen by terrified soldiers. Their planes made a whooshing sound like broomsticks through the dark. Funny, isn't it? A word once used to condemn women became, centuries later, a badge of fear for men facing women's strength. Legends evolve, but their echoes remain. So, dear listener, ask yourself, have you ever woken in the dark, breath caught in your throat, sure that someone or something was there? The old folk would say you'd met the Nachthexen. I say you've met the weight of history pressing down, reminding you that fear is the oldest shadow of all. And with that, we leave W.R.'s book smoldering. But not all stories can be explained away by folklore or fear. Some controversies cut deeper, raising questions historians still argue about. Were these witch hunts truly about religion, or was there something more human, more political at work? To find that answer, we must step into the world of books that guided the trials, and the propaganda that turned neighbors into enemies. The stage is set for the greatest controversy of all. By now, we've walked through caves that echoed with whispers, villages that burned their healers, and cities that devoured themselves in fire. But behind all the smoke, there remains a lingering question. Why? Why did Europe turn on itself so viciously? Why did ordinary people embrace such madness? To answer that, we must step into the tangled web of faith and fear, where holy texts became weapons, and the line between devotion and domination blurred. Let's start with a book. Not just any book, but one with a title that even sounds like a curse. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor. This text became the go-to manual for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches. Think of it as the 15th century equivalent of a how-to guide, except instead of baking bread or building birdhouses, it instructed judges on the finer points of torture and execution. The book argued with chilling certainty. Witches were real. Women were most likely to be witches, and the only way to protect society was to root them out mercilessly. It was a bestseller in its time, reprinted dozens of times across Europe. Imagine priests and magistrates flipping through its pages like students cramming for an exam. Ah yes, flying ointments, devil's marks, backs sealed with kisses. Got it, ready for court. But here's where controversy begins. Even in its own era, the Malleus was debated. The church never officially sanctioned it, and some scholars dismissed Kramer as a fanatic. Yet somehow, his book outlived its critics. Why? Because it told people what they wanted to hear, that all their fears, plague, famine, failed harvests could be blamed on someone tangible, preferably an old woman down the road. And that leads us to the first great controversy. Were the witch trials truly about religion? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. Priests thundered from pulpits, quoting scripture about, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Inquisitors wore crosses as they lit the pyres. Trials were framed as holy battles between Christ and Satan. But peel back the layers, and another motive glares through. Control. Consider the midwives. For centuries, women had carried the knowledge of herbs, childbirth, healing. They knew how to ease pain, how to bring life safely into the world, how to comfort the dying. This knowledge was power, and it was power that men in robes and crowns did not share. The trials became a convenient way to strip women of that authority. What better way to undermine them than to declare their skills witchcraft? A woman who delivered babies without the church's blessing, dangerous. A widow who sold herbal remedies instead of sending villagers to a physician approved by the guild, subversive. In this way, the trials became less about saving souls and more about monopolizing knowledge. Let's not forget the politics. Witch trials thrive where rulers needed distraction. Famine? Blame witches. War losses? Blame witches. Rebellious peasants? Clearly bewitched. In some places, trials conveniently targeted enemies of the local elite. Neighbors denounced neighbors not out of faith, but out of envy, greed, or sheer spite. That cow you wanted? Accuse its owner. That plot of land? Whisper about broomsticks. By the time the court was through, you'd inherit it all. And this brings us to the second controversy. Were the trials really about witches at all? Or were they simply about fear turned into a currency of power? There are chilling case studies. In Bamberg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631, a witch panic spiraled so wide that even the city's mayor was executed. His crime? Questioning the frenzy. His widow later testified that their property, houses, vineyards, wealth was confiscated by the bishopric. Convenient, isn't it? Eliminate dissent, gain land, and call it holy justice. In Scotland, King James VI himself became obsessed with rooting out witches after a storm nearly wrecked his ship. He was convinced witches had conjured the winds. His paranoia was not only personal, it shored up his authority. By presenting himself as God's chosen witch hunter, he wrapped monarchy and religion together, tightening his grip on the throne. And let us not forget the victims caught between faith and fear. Imagine being accused, dragged before a panel of solemn men quoting the Malleus. Imagine them demanding, "Do you confess? Did you dance with Satan?" Silence could mean torture. Denial could mean death. Confession, too, often ended the same way. What choice was there? And here's a bitterly funny aside. The Malleus claimed that witches could steal men's masculinity. Yes, really. According to Kramer, witches collected men's genitals in nests or boxes, keeping them as trophies. Ridiculous. Certainly. Believed? Absolutely. Imagine being a terrified villager, clutching yourself as you listen to sermons about women stealing manhood. No wonder men lined up to condemn them. Better to burn the neighbor than risk losing your dignity in some supernatural handbag. Of course, not everyone agreed. The controversies raged even then. Some theologians argued that the trials relied on superstition, not scripture. In Spain, Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Father as insisted that evidence was thin as smoke. In the Netherlands, skeptics scoffed at the idea of flying broomsticks. The debates became a shadow or ink versus fire. Sadly, the fire often won. But centuries later, historians still wrestle with the question: were the trials primarily the product of genuine belief in Satan's army, or were they elaborate cover stories for politics, misogyny, and greed? Perhaps the truth is both. Fear is never pure. It mixes with ambition, prejudice, and hunger for power until the flames blur their origins. So, dear listener, ask yourself, if you lived then, which story would you believe? Would you accept that your misfortunes were caused by witches dancing in caves? Or would you suspect that the real witches sat on the judge's bench, cloaked not in darkness, but in silk and velvet, wielding pens sharper than any broomstick? Controversy is not comfortable. It forces us to admit that history is not only about victims and villains, but also about the ordinary people who went along, who whispered names, who turned faith into firewood. And in that uncomfortable truth lies the heart of Europe's witch trials. As the debates rage, the pyres continue. For while scholars argued over books and motives, real men and women continued to die. In our next step, we leave the ink-stained manuals and step into the windswept coasts of Scotland, where royal paranoia made the trials more dramatic than any sermon. King James himself would take the stage, and witches became pawns in the chess game of monarchy. The smoke of Germany's controversies fades, and we turn our gaze north, across storm-tossed seas and mist-shrouded hills, to Scotland. If Spain's caves whispered and Germany's cities blazed, then Scotland roared with royal paranoia. Here, witchcraft was not merely the concern of peasants or priests, it became the personal obsession of a king. Picture the late 16th century. King James VI of Scotland, future James I of England, sits brooding in his chambers at Holyrood Palace. He is young, intelligent, bookish, but also deeply insecure. Raised amid plots and betrayals, haunted by the violent deaths of his mother Mary, Queen of Scots, and the constant threat of rebellion, James carried fear like a cloak, and nothing stoked that fear more than the devil. James's obsession crystallized in 1589, when storms nearly sank the ship carrying his new bride, Anne of Denmark, to Scotland. Tempests battered the sails, waves slammed against the deck, and sailors swore they had never seen such fury. To James, it was no ordinary storm. It was witchcraft. Someone somewhere had conjured the sea itself to murder him. And thus began the infamous Northberwick witch trials. It started with confessions extracted from ordinary people under extraordinary duress. A maid named Gaylis Duncan, pressed by her master, admitted to having healing powers. From there, the net spread wide. Soon dozens were accused of gathering on a beach in North Berwick, meeting with the devil, and plotting against the king himself. The stories grew absurdly theatrical. Witches sailing in sieves across the sea, witches kissing the devil's backside, witches raising storms with cats thrown into the ocean. But the absurdity mattered little when the king himself believed it. James personally interrogated suspects, demanding details, leaning in with sharp eyes. He wanted proof that his paranoia was justified, and proof he received confessions sculpted by torture. Nails pulled, limbs stretched, skin seared until the accused would say anything. The trials became a spectacle. Imagine Edinburgh in winter, cold winds whipping down the wines, citizens crowding into halls to hear the latest accusations. Pamphlets spread stories faster than gossip. Names were named, and those names dragged new victims into the fire. Over 70 people were accused in the Nachthexen trials alone. Many were executed. One of the most infamous was Agnes Sampson, an elderly midwife. Before King James himself, she was stripped, shaved, and searched for the devil's mark. She was tortured until she confessed to raising storms against his ship. James listened, convinced. When she supposedly repeated words he had once whispered privately to his bride, the king declared it undeniable proof. Of course, in reality, Agnes may have overheard gossip or simply invented a guess. But to James, it was revelation. Agnes was burned, her ashes scattered to the winds she had allegedly conjured. The king's obsession did not stop there. In 1597, he published his own book, Demonology. It was a manifesto of belief in witches, demons, and the devil's work on earth. Unlike skeptics who questioned the madness, James doubled down, providing intellectual justification for hunts. His words spread across Britain, giving moral weight to trials for decades to come. And here's the dark humor. Demonology was, in essence, the king's fan fiction, a blend of theology, folklore, and his personal fears, dressed up as scholarship. Imagine if today's rulers publish conspiracy theories as official doctrine, and you understand the impact. People did not dare doubt the monarch's printed word. But paranoia cuts both ways. James's fixation on witchcraft revealed his insecurity. To believe the devil plotted against him so personally was almost flattering proof of his cosmic importance. Yet it also exposed his fragility. A king who feared shadows could be manipulated by those who knew how to whisper. Accusations of witchcraft became political tools. Rival factions could brand enemies as witches and watch the king's wrath ignite. The trials thus became theatre of power. Ordinary villagers accused one another. Yes, but behind the scenes, courtiers and nobles played their own games. If a rival fell to accusations, their lands and influence could be seized. In this way, the fires of Scotland burned not only herbs and hair, but ambition and rivalry. And still, through all this, the myths grew. In Scotland, people whispered of covens dancing on Courton Hill, of witches flying to the Orkneys on broomsticks, of storms raised with charms of bone and ash. Each story, no matter how wild, seemed plausible when the king himself nodded gravely at its telling. It's worth remembering, though, that not all Scots shared James's zeal. Skeptics existed, quietly doubting. Some judges hesitated. Some ministers whispered of hysteria. But their voices were drowned beneath the thunder of royal conviction. When a monarch believes in witches, who dares contradict him? Now, let's slip in a cheeky modern reality check. Imagine you're on a flight today. Turbulence rattling the cabin. Would you immediately accuse the passenger in 12B of hexing the plane? No, you'd grumble about air pockets and order another ginger ale. But in James's world, turbulence was not physics, it was evidence of war between heaven and hell. The absurdity of it makes us smile now, but to the king, it was deadly serious. The Nachthexen trials marked a turning point. They showed how witchcraft accusations could be inflated to national crisis when tied to political paranoia. They also revealed how fragile monarchy could be, how even kings trembled before shadows. And here lies a curious irony. As James aged, his obsession cooled. By the time he sat on the English throne, he grew skeptical, even dismissive, of certain witch trials. Perhaps experience tempered his fear. Perhaps ruling England demanded more pragmatism. Or perhaps he realized that hunting shadows only left blood on his hands. Still, the damage was done. His book remained. His trials remembered, his paranoia immortalized in pamphlets. Scotland carried the scars. Families ruined, women burned, whispers lingering in stone villages for centuries. So, dear listener, imagine standing on the shores near North Berwick today. The waves crash, the wind howls, gulls wheel overhead. If you listen closely, can you hear the echoes of women's screams mingling with the surf? Or is it only the wind? History does not tell us. It only leaves us with silence, broken by waves. From royal paranoia, we now move to quieter acts of defiance, those who dared to resist, those who whispered charms in secret, those who even halted executions at great risk to themselves. For amidst the madness, courage flickered, and it is to those flickers we now turn. By now, we have trudged through caves that whispered of demons, cities that burned themselves hollow, and palaces where kings trembled before storms. Yet not every voice was raised in accusation. Not every hand reached for the torch. In the margins of hysteria, in kitchens, chapels, and secret gatherings, There were those who resisted quietly, bravely, often at terrible risk. Their names are fewer in the chronicles, their stories less preserved, but their courage lingers like embers refusing to die out. Imagine a village in Central Europe, 1630. The witch hunts are raging, trials clogging the courts, pyres smoking in the fields. But in a cramped cottage at the edge of town, a woman leans over her neighbor's sick child. She whispers a charm, lays a poultice of herbs on the boy's chest, and prays. She knows the danger. If someone sees her muttering over leaves and roots, it could be called witchcraft. If the child dies despite her efforts, suspicion could fall on her. And yet she does it anyway, because knowledge is meant to heal, not to wither in silence. This was the resistance of women, the healers, midwives, wise ones who continued their craft in defiance of edicts and fear. They stitched herbs into sachets to protect against plague. They brewed teas for childbirth. They whispered lullabies that carried remnants of pagan prayers. Each act was a rebellion against a monopoly of priests and magistrates who declared that only their rituals were holy. But not all resistance was hidden in cottages. Some flickered even in the courts themselves. Consider Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest in Germany, who witnessed countless witch trials. He was forced to hear confessions wrung from the tortured. He watched innocents condemned, and at last he could not remain silent. In 1631, he published Cautio Criminalis, a blistering critique of the trials. He wrote, "Torture brings innocent persons to confession, not truth. It was a dangerous stance, nearly suicidal. Yet Spee's words spread like sparks in the wind. Judges read them, scholars debated them, and slowly, seeds of doubt took root." Another was a judge in Rothenburg, Germany, Johann Matthias Mayfahrt, who openly defied the hysteria. He halted executions, questioned evidence, and demanded fairer standards. His actions drew criticism, even threats, yet he saved lives simply by daring to slow the machinery of fear. One contemporary sneered that he was soft-hearted, but in a world where cruelty was normal, softness was revolution. And then there were stories of sheer defiance, like that of Katharina Kepler, the mother of astronomer Johannes Kepler. In 1615, she was accused of witchcraft, no surprise, given her herbal remedies and outspoken nature. But her son, already famed for charting the motions of planets, threw himself into her defense. He studied the law, challenged procedures, demanded justice. Against all odds, Katharina was acquitted after years of imprisonment. A rare victory, a crack of light in the darkness. Yet for every Katharina, countless others went undefended. Resistance was fragile, often silenced by fire, which makes the courage of those who spoke, healed, or doubted all the more extraordinary. Let us not forget the villagers who resisted in quieter ways. Some refused to testify against neighbors. Some sheltered the accused. Some whispered prayers of protection rather than condemnation. Their names are lost, but their choices mattered. They remind us that history's pages, though dominated by pyres and kings, were also filled with small acts of humanity. Of course, resistance carried consequences. Priests like Friedrich Spee risked their lives. His book was published anonymously, for fear of the stake. Judges who doubted too loudly sometimes found themselves accused. Villagers who sheltered suspects risked joining them on the pyre. Courage, in those days, was not a speech in Parliament, it was a whispered no, when the crowd screamed yes. And here's a cheeky reality check. If you've ever sat silently in a meeting while everyone else nodded at a terrible idea, you know how hard resistance can be. Now imagine that silence meant saving your life, and speaking meant risking fire. It puts our everyday courage, or lack thereof, into perspective, doesn't it? The silent resistance was not only about individuals. Over time, it became cultural memory. In places where trials ended, people began to tell the stories differently. Witches were recast in folk tales not always as villains, but sometimes as tricksters, healers, even misunderstood women. The act of storytelling itself became a form of resistance, reshaping the narrative so that future generations would remember not only fear, but also compassion. As we walk forward in our journey, picture a Europe still burning, but with sparks of defiance glowing in the ashes. Women clutching herbs with trembling hands but refusing to let go. Priests scribbling books that condemn torture even as they risk torture themselves. Sons defending mothers. Judges halting trials. Neighbors choosing silence over betrayal. These are not the stories most history books tell. They do not have the drama of a king's paranoia or the spectacle of a mass execution. But they remind us of something essential. Even in the darkest hysteria, there were those who dared. And so, with those embers warming our path, we step into the final stretch of our story. The fires are dying, the hysteria fading. Europe will change slowly, painfully, and the trials will decline. But the echoes will linger, carried by descendants, festivals, and myths. The question is, what do we do with those echoes? The fires burn for centuries. From Zugarramurdi's caves to Triers' ruined streets, from W. Aspig's pyres to North Berwick's stormy shores, Europe had waged war against shadows. By the late 17th century, the flames began to dim. Skeptics grew louder, rulers wearier, and the tide of enlightenment lapped against the old superstitions. Yet though the execution slowed, their smoke lingered in memory. Imagine the survivors. Children who watched their mothers burn. Husbands who buried wives branded with shame. Villages scarred by betrayals that split neighbor from neighbor. In some towns, the stigma clung for generations. Families whispered about their witch blood. Others avoided marriages with descendants of the accused. Even centuries later, surnames carried a faint taint, as though the ashes had never fully washed away. And yet, life went on. Fields were tilled again, markets reopened, churches rang their bells. Descendants grew into new roles: farmers, craftsmen, teachers. Some carried the shame silently. Others turned it into defiance, keeping alive the stories of those lost. In this way, the condemned were never entirely gone. The myths too endured. Mary still flickered in Basque mountains, no longer demonized but reclaimed as a symbol of nature's power. The Nachthexen reappeared, centuries later. A Soviet women pilots bombing Nazi camps, fearsome, heroic, turning an old curse into a modern badge of honor. Even in bedtime stories, witches survived. Children whispered of broomsticks and cauldrons, sometimes with dread, sometimes with glee. Festivals in Zugarramurdi now celebrate what once condemned. Tourists light bonfires where inquisitors once shivered in judgment. Costumes, music, laughter replaced torches and chains. It is history's slyest revenge. Witches, once symbols of terror, now symbols of freedom and joy. But history never closes neatly. It leaves us with questions, with controversies still unsettled. Were the trials truly born of religious devotion, or were they masks for misogyny, greed, and control? Were the accused victims of ignorance, or martyrs of resistance? And what do we, centuries later, choose to remember? So here we arrive at two possible endings, one bright, one dark. The bright ending: from the ashes of fear, humanity grew wiser. The skepticism of priests like Friedrich Spee, the courage of judges like Mayfort, the defense of Katharina Kepler all paved the way for a future where reason triumphed over hysteria. Science blossomed, superstition waned, and the Enlightenment carried Europe forward. Descendants of the accused live today without fear of pyres, free to brew chamomile tea, talk to cats, and dance by bonfires without threat of firewood. The legacy of the trials, though bitter, became a lesson. Never again should rumor rule over reason. The dark ending, but perhaps the shadows never left. Perhaps the pyres only changed shape. The whispers that once condemned witches still echo in scapegoats of every age, in rumors that spread faster than truth, in societies eager to blame the powerless for misfortune. Today, we may not burn witches, but we burn reputations, livelihoods, entire lives with words and accusations. The stage is digital, not medieval. Yet the play remains. If this is the ending, then the witch trials were not history at all, they were rehearsal. Which ending do you choose, dear listener? The hopeful or the haunted? History leaves it to you. And now, dear friends, let us set the torches down. The flames of Europe's witch trials, though long extinguished, still glow faintly in our imagination. You have walked through caves, stood before pyres, and listened to voices trembling between truth and fear. You have seen kings swayed by storms, judges torn by conscience, women whispering charms as acts of defiance. And though their world was cruel, though their choices were bound in chains of superstition, they remind us of something quiet, something tender, that even in the darkest nights, human beings still reached for meaning, for survival, for hope. As you lie back now, let the weight of centuries drift away. Hear instead the soft rustle of wind through trees, not the crackle of fire. Picture the mountains of the Basque country, no longer filled with screams, but with laughter, songs, and footsteps of travelers exploring caves with lanterns in hand. Picture Triers gates, not smothered in smoke, but lit gently by the evening sun. Picture the Scottish coast, waves lapping calmly. No longer conspiracies in every gust of wind, only the eternal rhythm of the sea. Breathe deeply, slowly, And know that you carry none of the guilt, none of the fear, only the story, safe now, a relic of history rather than a danger of today. Let it fade softly, like embers glowing faintly, like voices hushed to whispers, until at last there is silence. And in that silence, rest.